You unlock this door with the key of compassion. Beyond it is another world, a world of science, a world of common sense, a world of sanity. You're moving into a land of both empathy and ethics, of nutritional knowledge and empowerment. You've just crossed over into Dr. Osborne's zone. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Dr. Osborne Zone. Today, I've got a very special guest, Jayne Buxton, who is the author of The Great Plant-Based Con. This is a book I've recently finished reading, and it was a fabulous read, and it was full of accuracy and historical data that I think many of you should understand and learn so that you can defend yourself from the propaganda that's being forced upon us through the powers that be. So, Jayne, thank you so much for being with me today. I appreciate you coming.
My pleasure.
Tell me a little bit. I mean, I looked at your background and your history, and so this looked to me like this was one of the first endeavors in like the nutrition realm in terms of writing. What possessed you to write a book on this topic?
Yeah, it does look a little strange when you think of all the other things I've written and the career in consulting and business that I had before that. I think that I was just fascinated by the kind of change in the tone that seemed to occur around the whole topic of nutrition, and particularly around the role of animal foods in nutrition. Around 2017, 2018, I saw it to get more intense, the whole vilification of meat, animal foods. And I started researching it really for my own benefit and to implement some dietary changes in my own life as well. But I had been reading a lot, and I noticed that the reading that I was doing did not jive with what I was hearing in the mainstream, in the press, on the news, whatever, in popular discourse. And that just alerted me to the fact that something was probably wrong and that there was misinformation being spread. And so the more I looked, the more I found, which is often the case. And I remember a trigger point or a tipping point being the Game Changer movie when that came out in November 2019, I believe. And I found it to be such an act of propaganda, clever propaganda. And I thought it would have immense influence. And in fact, it has had immense influence. And so I felt the need to counter that message. And I didn't see a book out there who was actually taking it head on. So I felt this would be the book. And funnily enough, I went to my agent and I told him what I wanted to write. And he said, you know, this is an interesting topic, but I don't think you're the one to do it. The reason being, I'm not a nutritionist and I'm not a doctor. So he felt that would be an uphill climb for me to do that. Anyway, I went away and put together a sort of 150-page proposal with a lot of data in it. And he got turned around and he said, okay, yeah, you should do this. So that's how it happened.
I mean, I'd argue you're the best person for it because, you know, as one of the points you make in your book is that many doctors are biased by their either their belief system, or they're biased by their academic influences or financial, backing.
Bias, yeah.
Somebody coming in that has none of that at stake and is just wanting to get to the truth. In my opinion, an investigative journalist is the best person to tackle the topic. So thank you for doing that.
You're welcome.
So, let's talk about, first of all, I know that the title of your book, The Great Plant-Based Con, because many of my listeners are probably vegetarian. And so for the sake of maybe helping them understand where we're going to go with this interview before they just turn off the TV, right? Or turn off the show, is you're not opposed to eating plant-based foods. You're just opposed to ignoring the nutritional benefits and values of meat-based foods or animal-based foods. Is that correct? Is that,
that is correct. That is correct. And I'm also opposed to the kind of mainstreaming of the idea that everyone can thrive on a plants-only diet and that it is best for everyone, because I think everyone is a big group of people and we're all individualized. We all have very, very different health needs, conditions that we're trying to cure, genetics, historic biology, nutritional needs. So I think it's a mistake to advocate for plant-based diets across the board. By all means, I mean, I love vegetables myself. I absolutely love them, and my plate is and fruits, and my plate is usually 3/4, full with those foods. But I started eating, and I have persisted in eating animal source foods because of the nutrients and because of what I had learned about how important they were for completely balanced nutrition. That doesn't mean you can't get decent nutrition from vegetarian diet, for instance, if you work at it and you make sure you know where it's all coming from and you got the right components and the right foods and the right quantities. So people should be able to eat however they want. And I fully respect any vegetarian and vegan who knows the facts, who knows the pros and cons of the diet, decides to do it anyway, but is not trying to push it on other people and is not trying to pretend that it is better for health and better for the environment.
Let's talk about that. So we've here in the last, I'd say 5-10 years, we've seen this really strong rhetoric rising about animal foods being bad for the planet.
Mm-hmm.
Can you dive into that a little bit? I'd like to dismantle that argument, because what we're hearing is that
mm-hmm.
cow pollution, so to speak, is destroying the planet, and if we would just stop eating cows, then global warming or climate change, whatever you want to call it, would end. But what's the reality of that? Because you really dug deep in that science. So talk us mm-hmm. through that rhetoric a little bit.
And actually, the science has moved on even a little bit since I wrote. But yes, people often, the starting point for the bad for the planet argument is that cows are responsible for huge amounts of methane. Okay, which is classified as part of the entire emissions picture globally. And, it has been claimed by some people, Cowspiracy, for instance, made the claim that it was cows caused 50% of emissions. Now, that was proved to be completely incorrect, and they had to backtrack on that. What is generally or has generally been accepted is that cattle generate 14.5% of global emissions. Now, that's interesting. That comes from the FAO. That has recently been downgraded to 11% based on some new data coming in, different timing of that data, maybe some different methodology. So, and at times, other studies have considered it to be 19%. So you get this range, but generally the sort of what I would call the sensible, scientifically based range you get is between 11% and 19%. Now, you have to say, is that a little? Is that a lot? Should we be doing something about that? Well, yes, we should. We should be doing something to try to mitigate those emissions in the same way that we're trying to mitigate every other source of emissions. All human activity, walking out your front door causes carbon emissions, right? So us living here on this planet, it is a problem for emissions. It generates it from the get-go. So then the question is, well, should we be focusing so heavily on the emissions from livestock, or would we be better off trying to eliminate those emissions from fossil fuels, which form the vast majority of emissions? I mean, because it seems strange to say cows are killing the planet, when the flip side is the other 80%, 85% of emissions are from fossil fuel use. So really, fossil fuels are killing the planet, and everything that we do with fossil fuels, because it's in every industry, every activity in human life, right? So that's, at the high level, you have to accept that percentage of emissions is maybe not as dramatic as people think it is. Then you have to look at the nuances of that analysis. So people often say, well, it is really bad because cows generate more emissions than transport. But hang on. Transport is calculated. The emissions from transport are calculated on a direct basis. So it's just the tailpipe emissions that are counted. They don't count the building of the cars or the roads or any of the infrastructure that goes into us having cars. Cows, on the other hand, have everything lumped in there. It's a life cycle inventory of emissions. And the FAO did a apples to apples comparison and said, if you were going to calculate these on the same basis, cattle would be 5% of global emissions and transport would be 14%. So that reverses the typical picture that you so often see.
Well, to me, that the natural thought too is, if we shut down cattle and livestock production in lieu of, let's say, soy-based meat products or corn-based or cereal grain-based products, what we're going to need is more emissions to do that farming, right? We're going to need more of the actual fossil fuel emissions in that farming and in that transport and in that storage of all of those things. I mean, those don't come without cost either. So every time I look at somebody, making the argument over, cows creating the problem, it's like, well, what's the solution? Well, first of all, is that even a problem, right? Because I think make an argument that that's not even really a problem, because cows add value. Cows add nitrogen back in cows through the cycle of life create soil improvements. So if we look at how farming is done, and this is just another question off that, is that do they differentiate in these research studies between cows that are biodynamically farmed and raised versus feedlot cows where they're in tight quarters, being force-fed food that's not natural for cows, right, to be produced in record speed so that they can get to market very, very quickly, versus, say, the cows that are just out on pasture grazing? Because I was talking to Joel Salatin. If you're familiar with him, but Joel.
Yes, I am.
And I don't quote me on these numbers, but I think it was the order of magnitude of I don't even want to say, because it was so much more. We had so much more livestock roaming the planet before human civilizations. It far outweighed what we currently have today to feed the human population. So if we're making an argument that animals would actually create an emission that would destroy the planet, you'd have to say that we actually have less cows today. We have less bison. We have less. Agriculturally speaking, we have far less animals on the planet today than we did at a point in the past history. And so how could one even try to make that argument? Because
that is correct.
Destroyed then. Anyway, my question was, has anybody done that differentiation between, conventional farming versus biodynamic agriculture?
Well, of course, individual farmers and some studies of individual farms have done that calculation and showed that so there was a study recently done in Wales that showed that far from the average, which is sometimes put about 45 to 60 to 100 kgs of CO2 per kg of meat, the Welsh system was producing 15 kgs per kg of meat. And I'll get back to the biogenic cycle that you referenced a second ago. Then there are others who can produce their beef for even fewer kgs. But what you find is that the studies which are most referenced and most often used as the definitive point of view on this tend to lump farms all in together. And in fact, they get their data from some of the worst sorts of farms. So I'll give you an example. There's a study by Poor and Nemeczek, which is really, really condemnatory of animal foods, and has come up with these big numbers, which are between 60 to 100 kgs of CO2 per kg of meat. But they have looked at farms all over the world, lumped everything together, and maybe not selected the Joel Salatin farms, the White Oak Pastures farms, the farms from all the regenerative farmers that I know here in the UK. And we know that their sample for the UK data was selected from 2 farms here. I don't know what they were. And that data showed a kilogram of CO2 cost, which was 3 times what other people have found the average to be here. So yes, it is the science, and unfortunately it is being seen as the science because that study is quoted ad infinitum. It really is, as if it's the only study that ever existed. And there are other studies that disprove it, but they don't get the hearing necessarily.
They're just kind of swept under the rug, and the big studies been cherry picked.
Absolutely.
The agenda or the appearance that we need to take fast action on this.
Yeah. Now, the other thing that these such studies as the one I've told you about is do not really reflect reality, is that they don't reflect that biogenic cycle that you were talking about, which is natural sources of methane, including that from cows, is seen as a cycle. So the methane goes up, but it is converted by OH, hydroxy radicals, into CO2, and it comes back down into the ground in the form of plants, photosynthesis action. Cows then help that action because of their treading action, because of their manure, because of the way they replenish carbon in the soil. It sucks in that carbon more readily. So that is deemed a cycle. Now, Oxford academics have said, because of that cycle, if cow herds were to remain the same, we would not get any future warming, further warming from the cow population, as it were. So it just goes around and around, as it were, if you want to think of it that way. If we increase the herd size, we do get warming, and that would be added. But if we just reduce herd size by a little bit, we can get a cooling effect. So the way we could be looking at that is cows are an opportunity rather than the culprits necessarily. Do you see what I mean?
Absolutely. Well, and then my mind also goes to, if you raise cattle properly and rotate them on grass, and and you use that land responsibly, you get the cows really actually helping us capture carbon from the atmosphere into the soil. Versus if you use big agriculture to grow plants, what are we using? We're using nitrogen fertilizers that unfortunately create dead zones all across wherever they're used. They're dead zones that we're now finding, that where plant life and matter and animal life won't really take or won't really grow. So what's the cost to the planet of using these synthetic nitrogen fertilizers?
Well, it's huge. I mean, I think nitrogen fertilizers generate 3 to 4% of all emissions just of themselves. Forget the other activities that go into farming those monocrop farms. But I think what's interesting, I was listening yesterday to a really good debate between a very strong plant-based advocate, ecologist, and a farmer of the Joel Salatin variety, and a scientist of that ilk as well. And the sticking point was just around the issue you've just mentioned. So the plant-based advocate was saying, well, we could just replace all these cows with plants. We wouldn't need quite so many because we're wasting a lot of the plants. We feed them to the cows anyway, which is a kind of distortion of the reality. But and we would just grow them in an organic system. We won't use fertilizers, and we'll feed the world that way. Now, quite rightly, the other sides of the debate said, well, how can you be ensured that when we move over to entirely plant-based farming, it's all going to be veganic, organic? How can we be sure it won't be just taken over by industrial forces and become another layer of industrial farming? And the evidence is that it would become that, because size wins. So what we're trying to do, I think really we need to peel back from the plants versus animals thing. And we need to be thinking, how can we encourage all of farming to be smaller scale, more local, more based on, with fewer inputs, more regenerative in nature. Now you can do regenerative plant farming too. But that's not going to produce the masses and masses of corn and soy that you need for these alternate meat burgers, right? So if we need to be keeping our eye on the prize, which is building communities around farms, implementing soil health principles, regenerative principles in farms, all farms, and forget this sort of battle between plants and animals, plant and animal farming.
I think it's always easy for people that are trying to make and escalate their bank accounts to create a false war with a false narrative. I mean, look at how many times in history we've seen that play out, even with the pandemic, and we end up with people at each other's throats over an academic argument that's false and created to make us go at each other. Absolutely. I love what you say. We need to quit the battle, and we need to recognize that both are important. That it's not necessarily one being evil or the other being better. It's more about how are we actually producing this stuff? Are we producing it with top quality? Are we doing it right? Are we doing it with the planet and regeneration in mind? Or are we just growing as much as we possibly can to make as much profit as we possibly can?
Yeah. And actually, if you advocate too strongly for, say, get rid of the methane from the cows because that's the quickest way to have an impact, and it's true, it would have a damn cooling impact short term, with a great nutritional cost and a great cost to livelihoods and communities and environments everywhere. But you could do that. But if you're adopting that approach to the methane from cows, why not the 50% of all methane which comes from lakes and wetlands and natural sources, right? So do we really think it's sensible to eradicate wetlands and eradicate lakes? No, we're trying to build those, right? We're trying to get more wetlands, which is a hypocrisy really in the whole argument, because wetlands are going to create more methane. If methane is really the problem, we need to be much more intelligent about how we're addressing it than simply getting rid of certain things.
I agree. And I would argue that using methane as the problem is really a short-sighted and oversimplified approach anyway. I think most people just don't understand enough about it. They don't know how to argue it one way or the other. What do you think about the consequences of removing meat? So let's talk about that for a minute.
Yeah.
So here we're saying methane is the enemy. Let's remove it by getting rid of cattle.
Yeah.
Okay. Now we have one of the best sources of natural fertilizer and actually carbon capture going away, right? So then there's that potential possibility that now if you don't have that happening, that we increase the problem in other ways beyond methane gases. But what is the human cost to that? So like we take away animal protein from the human diet. Let's talk about that. What do you see from a health perspective in the human population?
So I'm going to look at this, answer that with reference to sort of a macro level study, and then a person's story that just came to me the other day. So at a macro level, you may have heard of the study by White and Hall that was published in PNAS in 2018. And that study modeled what the US system would be like if everyone went vegan. And what they concluded was that it would generate a reduction of just 2.6% in the US emissions, but this would be at huge nutritional cost. And also the calories that you'd be required to eat to get the nutrients would be something, I think it was about 4,000 calories, because you have to top them up. Plant foods are not as dense with nutrients, and they're certainly not as dense with essential amino acids in the protein. So you need to eat more of them. So that was one very good study which showed that there would be unintended consequences of removing animals entirely from the system. And that's undoubtedly true. And then I look at it also from the perspective of my conversations with many people now who have cured themselves, healed themselves from various conditions with meat-heavy or meat-exclusive diets. And conditions like autoimmune diseases, Crohn's, depression, allergies, gastrointestinal problems. And the other day, I was told a story about somebody who had completely reversed their bipolar with a ketogenic, meat-intensive diet. And these people aren't lying. And these people are real, and they need to have access to the food that is healing for them. And I worry about what would happen in a world where we mandate certain diets and mandate certain levels of meat consumption that those people are not accommodated for. Yes, okay, it's arguable some people could eat less meat and not suffer at all. Some people maybe do eat too much meat. And some countries have much higher consumption than others. I think Australia is the very highest. That doesn't mean that everybody within those countries needs to eat less meat. So I don't like the lack of nuance in that message. I think it's really dangerous.
Yeah, I would agree. It's dangerous. I see the same thing clinically. We take most people in the U.S. The average American diet, which is oftentimes referred to as SAD, the standard American diet, is very, very carbohydrate rich.
Yeah.
And the carbohydrates are predominantly highly processed, right, where there's synthetic vitamins added. And the interesting history about this was in 1943, this is in the US, the government banned the sale of processed grain foods because it was responsible for somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 deaths a year from malnutrition.
Wow, I didn't know that.
This is where the food fortification laws started, right? So we fortify with B vitamins like niacin and thiamine, right? Because pellagra and beriberi were epidemic disease problems that could kill you, right? So they banned the sale of grain in 1943, and then marketers like Kellogg, brilliant marketer, said,
oh yes,
eat more cornflakes because now it's fortified and better for you, right? So they just kind of twisted the language a little bit to help people understand that they should eat more of those products, even though technically the slogan should have been, "Don't eat us, we'll kill you." So we had to add synthetic vitamins so that it wouldn't, right? And that, but as you know, the headline never reads that way. It reads
no.
It reads toward industry favor.
Yeah.
But let's talk about new. So you said that if people quit eating meat, there would be a potential onslaught of illness as a relationship to different types of illnesses, autoimmune disease, protein malnourishment, inability to
iron deficiency, zinc deficiency.
Yes. B12, methionine, all the things that are predominantly found in the diet through animal protein versus, say, purely plant-based proteins.
Yeah.
All that kind of goes away. And so now we have a different problem, which is we need more plant-based foods, which means more carbon emissions from more nitrogen fertilizer, more gas being spent to transport more food, right? We're growing these things largely on a commercial scale. You've got the transport is, in my opinion, one of the biggest costs if we're talking about global health. It's one of the biggest costs of detriment, and so this all has to be transported. Then it all has to be cooked, and so you have to prepare and cook it. So it really doesn't really solve a problem.
And what you didn't mention, but I know you would be thinking of, is not only all those things would increase, but carbohydrate intake would increase across the board. It's already really high. It's higher than many people think is justifiable or advisable. And that can only increase because most protein sources of a plant-based nature are carbohydrate rich.
Yeah. I mean, no doubt about that. I was saying earlier that in America, most Americans are 70 plus carbohydrate percentage, like we're talking about total caloric value. I think it was a study in the 90s that showed that wheat represented 60% of the total caloric intake of the average person. 60% from wheat alone.
Yeah.
And then you have the other aspects like glyphosate or Roundup, right? And the chemicals beyond the nitrogen that are part of those.
Of course, the answer from people who are absolutely hell-bent on promoting a plant-based diet for everyone, the answer is always, well, you just need to do it better. You need to be careful. You need to plan. You don't have to, you shouldn't have more than, I think one book I was reading recently said 6 slices of bread a day was optimal. And I'm thinking, wow, if I ate 6 slices of bread a day, I'd be the size of a house, but also my gut would not be would not thank me. But, and then they say, throw in the seeds. for the vitamins, the nuts and the special nori seaweed, right? And I'm thinking, well, where are people going to get this stuff? Who's going to eat a plate full of nori seaweed and a few flax seeds? I'm sorry, but nobody's going to do that. So even though in theory, it is entirely possible to construct a vegan diet that has all the elements in it, most of the elements in it. The idea that that is at all practical for most people in the world and that it will ever happen, I think is just ridiculous, is nonsense.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that.
You're going to tell somebody roaming around Africa who's got a cow and some milk from that cow, instead they should go find some flax seeds? I'm sorry.
Yeah, and then even beyond that, you run into one of the fundamental problems I think you run into outside of B12, mass global scale of B12 deficiency, which will cause heart disease, nerve disease, among other problems. So it'll increase the medical burden.
Yeah.
But, how do you get omega-3 from a strictly plant-based diet? I mean, you get linolenic acid.
You get ALA, right? You can get ALA from flax seeds and chia seeds and things like that.
But not
the conversion is not. The conversion is not perfect to EPA and DHA, although some claim it is. So there's quite a lot of pseudoscience around this, and you have to be really careful, because I've read just recently that you can get all the DHA and EPA that you need from a tablespoon of chia seeds. And
I'll speak to that clinically, right? So outcomes based, like forget the rhetoric.
Yeah,
I test every patient. We do what's called an omega check, which is a percentage of the fatty acids that are in the membrane of the red blood cells, which gives us an idea of what their omega-3 levels are like in their diet. Mm-hmm. It's largely my experience when somebody's trying to achieve adequate EPA and DHA from an animal source, we can never get their total percentages really up over 4%. So like the total, and it's supposed to be somewhere around 8 to 12%. So we're at half using vegetarian sources, even with supplementation from plant-based sources. So even if we're using extra flax or extra chia that are commonly used as vegan-based plants, we still can't get it above 5%. And when you look at EPA, we're 5%,
barely above 5. Did you say
above 5?
Wow. Yeah.
So I haven't seen it to be possible, even in people that do better with plant-based diets, which there are people like that. There's different genetic aspects that we look at to help understand who might do better with more plants versus more animal. Yeah. And those individuals that are better with plants still can't get their omega-3 levels up to what we would consider to be protective.
Yeah.
Necessary.
That's interesting. And have you found a study on that, or this is clinical experience, but have you found a study that replicates that as well, that finding?
I haven't, but I also haven't looked for that study.
Yeah.
So I can't claim that I've looked, but that's just my experience in the practice. So.
And you're not alone. I mean, I spoke to a number of nutritionists in the course of researching the book, and a naturopath said to me she couldn't get her patients up above with the seeds and the plant-based sources either. So it's very consistent. But I'm on the hunt for that study that tells us that, because I think that would be really interesting to know.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree. So let's back up a minute. We talked about the cost of like maybe going total vegan on human health. We've talked about the potential downfalls in agriculture and the way that it's currently done and how that really wouldn't solve the problem anyway. Where's this message coming from? Like there's a huge push, right? We see it all around us, this push to save the planet by going plant-based. We see this message of meat is bad, plants are good. Yet when we look at the meat alternatives, right, like the soy-based burgers or the pea-based protein stuff, what we are seeing is horrific, right? It's like the worst thing you could possibly put in a human body to try to achieve health ever. And these things are being highly touted and promoted by the same voices that are saying meat is bad. So where do you think this is all coming from? Who's pushing this agenda?
Well, it's coming from many places, and that's the problem. And those places reinforce one another. So there's nobody at the middle saying we must do this and pulling all the strings. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not, when I say it's a con, it's not one con person doing it. It's a multiplicity of forces. So, for example, you'll have the ecologists who really, really do believe that domesticated animals are a blight on the land as well as causing emissions. And they want to take them all off the land and rewild that land. And they want to see the return to forests and wetlands and just really open plains. And that is, from an ecologist perspective, that is what's motivating them. That's where that message comes from, because their priority will be rewilding. Doesn't matter what you say about human nutrition or about the cost to farmers and communities and all of that. That's their priority. They are endorsing the work of other scientists who believe in the vegan cause, who do a lot of research, say at Harvard, who do research, turnout research, which is always skewed towards a plant-based outcome being better. And there are many different ways that they can skew that. But if you dig beneath the surface of their studies, they don't hold water. Those people get funded by large groups like, I won't name them, but large multinational ultra-processed food companies who benefit when we use more plants, when we stick to a plant-based kind of diet, because all of their stuff is plant-based, right? By and large. So they reinforce the studies, which links very nicely to what the ecologists who have another motive want to say. And then you get people such as the philanthropists, try and say that word, such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who pushes their message. Plant-based meats are good. They invest in plant-based meats. They also buy up farmland. What are they doing with that farmland? Probably not converting it to regenerative agriculture, probably using it to generate the plants which go into the plant-based meats. What else do? They fund The Guardian over here in the UK, which is a newspaper which consistently pushes an anti-livestock message. They give them 2 million, no, that was another group, gave them £2 million. An animal rights charity gave them £2 million. I don't know the amount given by Bill and Melinda Gates, but they fund The Guardian. They also fund one of the primary sources of data that we rely on in this debate, an organization called Our World in Data, which is very heavily populated by those of a vegan mindset and churns out study after study and fact after fact, which seems to condemn animal foods. So Bill and Melinda Gates' money is going in there too. So the whole thing is creating this almost incontrovertible wall of messaging, right? It's very hard for the average person to stand up and say, oh, that can't be right. That's why when some people hear about the title of my book and what it's about, they say, well, how can you write that? Everybody knows the opposite is true. Everybody knows. The level of consistency in the messaging between all of these parties, throw in the WHO, throw in the Eat Lancet Commission, they all have independent motivators, but they all are aligned, and they create this message which is very, very difficult to argue against. That sounds depressing, doesn't it? It sounds a bit depressing.
I'd say there are no new tricks in the world. This has probably been going on before we turned our attention to this topic. I mean, I imagine any topic you would investigate or research, you'd probably see the same type of corporate, governmental, pseudoscience backing, to enrich the pockets of a small few while, not really caring about the end user consumer's health. What you mentioned in your book, you talked a lot about the intricacies of how the food policy is created by some of the people that have the most to gain from not allowing us to really be healthy. Can you speak to that a little bit about, you mentioned, one of the things that you just talked about Harvard, and I think in your book, one of the areas was that Harvard researchers were actually falsifying data about sugar. Right, to divert the attention away from fat. You had a section in your book on cholesterol. Can you speak more to that and just in nutrition in general?
Yeah, so I think that, the influence of corporations is felt in many ways. So, for instance, in the UK, we have a set of guidelines, much like your own. We have a plate it's called the Eat Well plate, and it's supposed to direct people as to approximately what they should be eating. Well, the people who formulated that plate, who came up with the guidelines, were from industry or connected with people from industry. So they may have been from industry groups, or they're directly from those companies. And you just have to say, well, what business do these people have formulating food guidelines? I just don't understand why on earth that is even allowed to be part of the process. It can only be because we are concerned that commercial enterprises need to have a say so that their businesses aren't damaged, so that they don't feel out of the loop of the conversation. It's all designed, the process, which is supposed to be about healthy eating, is designed to pacify the corporate world, basically. And the same is true in the US. You'll find that lots of the researchers who formulate the guidelines are paid, have other relationships with food corporations. So that is a fact. So that's one way that influence seeps in. I guess the other way is at the global level, we get guidelines which come out, such as the Eat Lancet Planetary Diet came out in 2019 also. 2019 was a big year. Lots of stuff happened then. And they advocated for what looks very much like a near vegan diet. It has very little animal foods on the plate. And they are backed and have a relationship with a conglomerate called Fresh, which is made up of lots of chemical and food, ultra-processed food companies, and some transportation companies, and some technology companies. Now, and fertilizer companies. Now, it's no secret what fertilizer companies have to gain if we go for an entirely plant-based future. Their sales of these nitrogen fertilizers would skyrocket. Whereas under a regenerative agriculture future, they would plummet. So it's easy to see why they don't want to support, or they never come out in favor of a regenerative farming approach. So that's just a couple of the ways that we see that corporate influence. But I think it's also it's felt very much in the sphere of LDL research, cholesterol research, as you were alluding to. We know that most of the research around reducing LDL through statins is industry funded. We also know that a very small group of people who are in hock to the industry because of the funding keep control of the data, so independent researchers can't really analyze it as much as they would like to. And we also know that even though some of that data can't be analyzed, the analysis that has been done has shown statins to be much less effective than we are told, and LDL, cholesterol itself, to be much less of a sole indicator of heart disease than we are told. But that message is never going to reach the population en masse unless we keep banging the drum, because the statin industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and their solutions to LDL is just too big and too important. And they will manage to keep that messaging very consistent. Don't eat animal source foods. Don't eat saturated fat, because your LDL will go up and that will give you a heart attack. And for your listeners, and probably you've have people tell them this before, the research now is just so far beyond that simplistic message. And the research, much research now shows that saturated fat is not a nutrient to be concerned about. But we'll still hear that, read that every single day in the mainstream.
Yeah, the attack on fat, while the processed food industry provides plant-based foods that are loaded with carbohydrates and synthetic ingredients
and vegetable oils, the puffer fats, polyunsaturated fats. Yeah.
It's quite unfortunate, because you're right. The average person, doesn't ever really put all of this together, because there's just too much conflicting information. Even if they were to go look for a different type of information, they might find it, but then it's like, well, what do I believe? Do I believe this over here? Do I believe this over here? Because
it's very hard for people.
A lot of these entities are governmentally funded, and so a lot of people can't fathom the fact that government, would actually try to lie to them, or to overcome that is a mountain in and of itself, because most people,
although it's amazing, isn't it, how we are resistant to thinking that companies and governments will lie to us. I mean, Pfizer has been the subject of two of the biggest lawsuits ever, right? And yet we consistently want to believe that they have our best interests at heart. Our UK
lawsuits, right? Like not like
criminal.
Like, hey, you did some things a little bit of below bar. It was, hey, people are dying. Hundreds of thousands of people are dying as a result of your lying. That's your research. It's not light, and nobody's gone to jail over that. I think they paid some fines.
Yeah, right? Huge fines, but they should be indicative of what's going on there. And in terms of government, well, we have this thing over here. This is a different topic because it's about COVID management as opposed to diet, but it is an indicator, I think. We have this situation over here where we have something called the COVID files. It's not called the COVID files. It's called. Anyway, one of our major papers has done an expose showing that it's the lockdown files, that's what it's called, showing evidence of the manipulation and the twisting of evidence and the lying that was going on from government officials. So we know this happens. Why don't we believe it can also happen in the sphere of food, diet, nutrition? We have to be a little bit skeptical. And I think if anyone wants to really manage their own health and to see their way through this absolute morass of conflicting data that they'll have on all sides, they need to remain healthily skeptical about both and maybe try and weigh up, pick a study and just have a little bit of a dig in it and see if they believe it, or find somebody trusted who they do think they can trust, who seems reasonable to them, who's proven themselves in the past to be reasonable. Someone like yourself, or someone like I always read Dr. Zoe Harcum's analyses of studies whenever they come out, because I know she'll give me the lowdown on exactly what went on in that study. So those resources are available to people, most people in the Western world. And we should be using them to help us find our way through the rubbish, really.
I couldn't agree more. I think if you look at the existing policies that have been in place for the last century, they've led to record-breaking illness, record-breaking healthcare expenses. We spent $4.2 trillion in the U.S. last year on healthcare. We don't have less disease. We don't have less cancer, heart disease, less obesity, less osteoporosis. We don't have less autoimmune disease. We have more. If the existing policies work, shouldn't the empirical data also spell out that the outcomes shouldn't, if the industry-funded research says that this is the way we should do it and the government follows suit and that's the way we do it, but we have more disease.
Yeah.
And to me, you
probably pretty safe doing the opposite.
Yeah. Throw all that research away and say, look at the empirical data, look at the outcome.
Yeah.
Which is what I love about clinical practice, because it's all outcome-oriented. A lot of times people will say, well, that's anecdotal. Well, anecdotal is the most important outcome you can have, because when a person has a favorable experience, and if that experience contradicts the research, do we now tell that patient who had a great experience and improved their health to, sorry, even though we improve your health, you need to go back to the other way because your anecdote doesn't matter.
That's right.
Too often we dismiss anecdote, and a lot of scientists will say, well, there was no placebo control. Well, did there need to be a placebo control when that person's autoimmune disease went away because they changed their diet to less of a processed food diet and more of a whole foods diet? So
yeah.
I agree. I think people need to stand up for themselves and they need to listen to themselves. They need to listen to their body.
Absolutely. And I think we need to stop putting epidemiology, observational studies, of which 99% of nutrition research is, up here on this pedestal while devaluing that clinical research. It's because that really is no better than an anecdote. As far as I'm concerned, most of that epidemiology, because of the way it's done, because of the methodological issues, because of the many flaws, and because it can only ever show associations, not causations, I don't think it's any more valuable to us, which is terrible to condemn an entire industry. But I think the epidemiology industry has become too big and too powerful.
I remember a vitamin E study a number of years ago. And it was a retrospective study where they asked people about their diets over the course of the last 10 years, right?
Yeah.
What did you eat for the last 10 years? Do you know? I don't remember what I ate last week, much less 10 years ago. And I think they had a prepaid conclusion in this study, which was to damn vitamin E as being an increased risk factor for cancer, because that's what the real goal was. I was invited one time to help with a study to do a congestive heart failure study. The doctors that wanted me involved didn't really want me. They wanted my product because we have a really premium CoQ10 product that he makes. And so they wanted us to donate our CoQ10. So I went to this meeting and they hand me the study parameters, and I'm like, you've just designed the study to completely fail on purpose. Probably. I didn't say on purpose, but I'm like, why did you design the study to fail? And their faces turned beet red. So I knew I had them. And because what they were doing was they were designing a study around patients with congestive heart failure where they wanted to give 30 milligrams of CoQ10. And in order for CoQ10 to be at all effective, you've got to be at least 300 milligrams.
Okay.
And so they knew that because the literature was already clear that 30 wouldn't do anything, right? So that wasn't anything that hadn't already been researched. And here they just publish another study that showed CoQ10 didn't work.
Yeah.
So that the media could run with the headline, CoQ10 ineffective with heart disease.
Right.
People would quit having faith in nutrition as a component to help them.
Yeah. Oh, that's just terrible. Good story though.
Yeah.
That's indicative.
So in your mind, what's the solution? So we know that you mentioned earlier that we got to quit battling over one versus the other and kind of come to the middle and say there are qualities about both that can be beneficial. But how should a person really begin the process of thinking about eating?
Yeah, that's my last chapter, and it was the hardest chapter I had to write because it is because on the one hand, I'm saying, do your research, be skeptical, don't believe everything you read in the papers, just believe people who are trusted. Here are the people that I trust, right? And I can see there are people who would say, well, A, I don't have time to do that research, and B, how do I know that those people are trustworthy, the ones that I recommend, right? So, I'm not saying it's easy, but I think you've hit on, I think we go back to simple. And most of the good advice that came out from interviews I did with experts in the field were, keep it simple, eat real food, eat a variety of real food, and choose that food for the nutrients it contains, and make sure you're getting nutrient dense. Don't eat something that offers you no nutrients. Okay, everybody has a Twinkie once in a while, I suppose, but don't make your diet based on those things that don't have nutrients. And that nutritional information is not very hard to find. Don't worry about, the fine tuning of this. And Dr. Kendrick, who's a great researcher into heart disease, I don't know if you've read any of his books. He said, look, I'm not going to give people prescriptions about precisely how much of each food they should be eating, how much carbohydrate, how much of, meat, fish, whether they should have blueberries 3 times a week or strawberries 10 times a week or whatever. He just said what I've just said, which is eat a balanced sort of wide variety of foods, include all the food groups, eat real food, cook it at home, fish, include all those things that your grandmother used to eat, meat, fish, eggs, dairy, and don't eat a lot of the ultra processed stuff. So for most people, I think that will help them. It'll go a long way, and that would improve from, say, the SAD diet that you were talking about, right? Because part of the problem with SAD diet is if you're getting all your food from outside, you don't even know what's in it as well. If you're getting it from fast food joints, you just don't know. And it's cooked with vegetable oils 99% of the time. So you're getting all of that. So for most people, I think eating the real food and cooking it at home and trying to get a variety is probably a great start. And then you'll have people who have conditions, and so they need to research those and listen to their bodies, and they have carbohydrate intolerance in the extreme. So for them, it's not good enough just to keep their carbs at, say, would be an average, a nice level. I mean, I'm usually around 50, 60, 70. It's very hard to get up above 100 without really stuffing in the carbs, I think. Some people can thrive on that. Some people need way less. And I think it's this thing you said about listening to your body, changing something, and then watching what happens and really paying attention, and then being prepared to either cut it back or add it in, depending on what you find. So if people could only think of eating as a tool, rather than thinking that the way they feel or a particular condition they have is just something they have to put up with, I think that would be a good beginning.
Yeah, that's real solid advice, I think. Listen to your body and be sensitive. Eat real food. When you were, I want to ask you one last question. When you were writing this book, what was the most shocking thing that you found that you weren't expecting to find, maybe, or like really surprised you, or was there?
Well, I think amongst the most shocking things was the extent of the information that I found out about the Seventh-day Adventist Church and how that had been involved in pushing the plant-based message since 1863, basically, since the church was founded. And you and I talked a little bit about this offline before we started, and I think what's so interesting is previously I had probably thought of their influence as being like any other religion or like any other big lobbying group. But in fact, they were much stronger than that and much cleverer than that. And the way they infiltrated dietitians' organizations and the dietary guidelines committees, and the way their prescriptions are now expounded by Loma Linda University, which is an entirely Seventh-day Adventist university, and yet those scientific studies are deemed independent. The way that happens, and the way they currently have a grip on the dietary guidelines committees in America, I think that was shocking to me, that this has been allowed to happen and that more people aren't aware. And then I was shocked when I found out that there's an organization called the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, which was originally a fully Seventh-day Adventist organization, and still has those ties. And they have been appointed as legitimate advisors to Biden's government in defining the new nutrition strategy. And they are also helping, they are involved in the design of New York's new vegan hospital food program with the mayor of New York. So this is not insignificant, this influence. And, sometimes when I tell the stories about SDA, and by the way, all of that everything I learned really, and the track that I went down was because of Belinda Fettke in Australia, who, I don't know if you know about Belinda Fettke because of her research. Do you?
No.
No. So she is an independent researcher who researched and published a great deal about the Seventh-day Adventist Church because her own husband, an orthopedic surgeon, was being prosecuted in Tasmania for prescribing low-carb diets to diabetic patients.
So they went after him.
They went after him because they're really in tight with the cereal companies, and they went after him. Dangerous stuff. So Belinda is a bright woman who put her life on hold for 4 years to do that research and still does the research. And so I learn a lot from her. And it is, as I said, the SDA is not an insignificant force, but when I tell the story to ordinary people, they think it's a conspiracy theory. So it's very difficult for people to understand the level of influence that they have.
Well, I mean, just from my own research on gluten, the Dr. Kellogg was part of that, right? He was part of that.
Of course he was.
And so we have probably one of the most powerful and influential and wealthy companies in the world, food companies in the world, as being Kellogg. And we've seen their influence, and they've gone so far as to utilize cartoon characters in the manner that cigarette companies, were chastised for.
Yeah.
To get kids to enjoy eating sugar, right, for breakfast, basically, which we know isn't good. Any parent worth their salt at all knows that Pop-Tarts and Frosted Flakes and Puffs, whatever they're all called, is not healthy.
Yeah.
But brilliant marketing won because, I always go back to the phraseology, part of your healthy, balanced breakfast. They never could say
it is a healthy, balanced breakfast.
A healthy breakfast. They had to say part of a balanced breakfast. And that was a brilliant stroke if you're a marketer, because that phrase I grew up with, in the 70s and 80s. It was like, part of your balanced breakfast. So that means it has to be a part of it. I can't have my breakfast without it. It has to be part of it. So it was just like that one play on words.
Yeah.
How much influence and power has just that one company had, because prior to 1895, cereal really didn't exist. The way we think of cereal today. And if cereal is the hallmark, in many cases it's the hallmark of vegetarian and plant-based diets, is cereal and cereal-based products and things like granola. This is what we're being told we should eat.
Yeah.
And we've seen 100 years or more of this, and we've seen the worst health outcomes that we could imagine. And I'm not alone in that. You've uncovered that. I think we could say, like, doctors like William Davis, who wrote Wheat Belly.
Absolutely.
Dr. David Perlmutter, who wrote Grain Brain, and Tom O'Brien, who's a friend of mine, that wrote Autoimmune Fix. We all talk about cereals as being really the antithesis to good health and nutrition.
Dr. Ben Bickman, who's, he's big on the insulin resistance. He's Why We Get Sick is his book. And he says, that cereal and orange juice is about the worst possible breakfast you could possibly eat if you want to keep your insulin resistance levels down. It's extraordinary. And as I say, we continue to see that influence today. And even in the mainstream. So, Tufts just came out with their Compass Food Index, which ranks different foods according to their healthfulness. And this is out of Tufts University. Mosafarian, very respected doctor, researcher of longstanding. And cereals are at the top of that healthy food index, while meat, eggs, fish, and dairy are down at the bottom, because the cereals are fortified. And they have allowed that to be the case, that you can count essentially a bad food or a less good food as healthy because it's fortified. That's a really clever trick. And I can't believe that Tufts fell for that and allowed that to be part of their study.
Yeah, I think it was an independent journalist did an analysis using that data and found that Lucky Charms had a higher nutrition index than I think it was a ribeye steak. Yeah,
that's right.
Ridiculous.
Yeah. And because they also have this bias against saturated fat, that also weighs in. So even though a steak is loaded with nutrients, it has that saturated fat. So you better not eat it. That's it's crazy. It's crazy. The whole world of nutrition science, analysis, research is crazy. I guess that's not a great thing to end on, is it?
Well, thanks to people like you, it's less crazy. And so we can find some sanity in that storm of hypocrisy and financial gain and interest and, manipulation. So really do appreciate your work and appreciate you coming on and sharing your knowledge with us today. It's been a great conversation.
And thank you for having me. It's been fun.
Where can people find you if they want to go looking for you?
So I have a website which is not very active, but it's basically where the book lives and where the resources for the book live and some articles and things. That's JayneReesBuxton.com. So that's REES in the middle. That's my middle name. And I'm on Twitter at Jayne Buxton. And I do reply to DMs if they're constructive. If they're horrible, I just ping them right away.
If they're constructive. Yeah.
I love that. I've met some great people through DMs on Twitter, to be honest. Some people that I now share a lot of research with, they whiz me stuff. We look at things, we question things, and they're great minds. And they're not necessarily all professionally earning a living in this field or professional researchers, but they are really doing good research. There are a lot of people out there doing it.
Yeah, no doubt. And that's the wonderful thing about technology is that we now have an arsenal of information accessible at our fingertips 24/7 for the most part that we never had before. So we couldn't even viably try to make some of these arguments.
That's right.
We had to navigate alone in the dark. And now we have this entire community that we can connect with.
That's right. It's great. It is good. You just have to filter out all the craziness.
Well, Jayne, it's been a pleasure to speak with you today. I really do appreciate you taking time, to be here with us, and look forward to future communications.
Yeah, I'm going to email you about a couple of things after this, on Monday, because some of the studies you mentioned are interesting. So I'm going to get you. You're not off the hook.
Okay.
Okay. Nice to see you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in to the Dr. Osborne Zone. Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe for more content like this. And make sure you come back next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time and Thursday at noon 30 for more episodes.